Thank you, Shailesh, for that introduction. And at the outset, I'd like to express my gratitude to Dr. Shirali and to the Sayati Center for inviting me to give this talk. And I mean this gratitude very sincerely. When Dr. Shirali wrote to me first asking if I'd be willing to speak at the gathering, I was extremely hesitant. I don't really see myself as a speaker, and I know that at the gathering a lot of people come who have a very deep interest in and seriousness about the kind of exploration that Krishnji was inviting us to do. And I wondered in such a gathering what I could possibly have to say. But then what induced me finally to accept the invitation was really the subject, living in a changing and divided world, the place of self-knowledge. I was intrigued by the subject, the topic, the main subject of the gathering, because it brings together three words which we use all the time: change, division, and of course self-knowledge. And as I was thinking about it, I realized I was getting into a bit of a rabbit's hole. There seem to be so many ways of looking at each of these and any number of connections between them. And I thought that the only way I would have the discipline to try and explore these deeply was in fact to accept the invitation. So hence I'm very grateful, because this talk has given me the opportunity to look at these words and their connections. Having said that, I should say at the outset that through this, I'm fairly sure in fact that I don't really have any fresh insights to offer. But I do have a lot of questions, some things I've perhaps noticed, and that's what I'd really like to share with you in the spirit of inquiry. I'm sure there's no last word on self-knowledge. So in the context of the theme, I think my real question I'm interested in is, what is self-knowledge? And I've phrased the question in this way: what is self-knowledge anyway? For reasons that you'll see as we go by. And I'd also like to say at the outset that one thing I seem to understand through this exploration is that self-knowledge is not knowledge at all, but something else. And I'll try to unpack in the course of this presentation what I think we might mean by self-knowledge, or one way of looking at it. Just succinctly, I think it's something like a state of being. And in that state, a kind of connectedness seems to happen. Now, this may seem a bit mysterious when I put it like this, but I hope to unfold that. So that really is the second part of my title, Only Connect. And again, we'll see why I've put it in that way. I think I'm very interested in the question of what bearing self-knowledge might have on issues of division and change. I'm trying to see what the connections might be. But before I go into that, I'd like to raise one question, which is that of intention. And there are two quotes here from one particular talk. It happens to be in the booklet which we have. To understand oneself, there must be the intention to understand. And with the intention comes an inquiring mind, a mind that is alertly aware without condemnation, without identification, and so on. So for me, the question is, why are we even interested in this question of self-knowledge? Is it something we've heard about? Is it that we find there are things about ourselves that we don't understand and would like to understand? Or is it that we think that by having self-knowledge, we live more intelligently, in less conflict with others and within ourselves? But then that brings us to a certain paradox, which I think the second quote from the talk reveals. One must study oneself more and more, but not with an object in view to achieve a result. Because if we seek an object, a result, we put an end to inquiry. So here, if our interest in self-knowledge is because we hope that it will help us to lead a more intelligent life, Krishnaji seems to suggest that any objective, right, however nice an objective it is, actually comes in the way of inquiry. And that inquiry should be, in some sense, directionless. There's one more question I'd like to lightly touch upon in this slide, which is, in the first extract, to understand oneself. In the second extract, one must study oneself. So the question which arises for me is, why this emphasis on oneself? Isn't there the possibility that this can lead to a kind of obsession with oneself? Might that not be a kind of isolating activity to be obsessed with knowing yourself? So this is a question I'd like to return to a little later in the course of this talk. So this is our theme, living in a changing and divided world, the place of self-knowledge. Now the way the theme is expressed, it might suggest that we're juxtaposing self-knowledge with the other two because self-knowledge might be a kind of antidote. I don't know if that's what the people who framed the theme intended, but it may look like that. And we need to see whether that's the case. But let's look at change and division, neither of which is new. Change is ubiquitous, it's there all the time. In the 4 days I've been here, every morning I've been walking the same path from the study center to the dining hall for breakfast. And just at the entrance to the senior school building where the class 11-12 block is, there's a whole cluster of beautiful and varied flowers, including on a tall stem a pink rose. And I noticed it because I was seeing a rose after a long time. And on the first day when I passed it, it was in perfect bloom. It had sort of reached its climax, maybe, of its existence. Each day since then it has been drooping a little, and now it is fairly withered. So that's one instance of change. We see it around us, we see it's natural in the plant world, we accept it. It's harder maybe to accept in our own lives. The changes our bodies undergo as we age, the various changes we experience in our lives. But change has always been there. And as for division, in fact, before I go into division, I think every generation at a certain stage in their lives begins to feel that things are changing for the worse. Things have never been as bad as they are now. This is not a new feeling. People have had this kind of doomsday feeling about the changes they see around them almost any time, even 300 years ago, and certainly today. As for division, yesterday there was a reference to the Kauravas and the Pandavas. So certainly there was division 3000 years ago. There's perhaps been division ever since humankind came into existence. And history shows that, the current world shows that in abundance. So the question is, why is it that we might feel despair about these things today? Right? One, as I said, is perhaps there's always the sense the world has never been as difficult as it is today, it's in a state of crisis. But there are other simpler things which explain this. Technology, for example. Right? Technology has accelerated the pace of change to a point where we no longer seem able to keep up with it. Artificial intelligence reveals the extent to which the microchip has advanced. It's as if technology has gone beyond our control. And that's something which makes us uneasy. So change is accelerated to a point today where it's not easy for us to come to terms with. And as for division, there are wars today, there have always been wars, there have been communal and other riots today, there always have been in one form or the other. But again, I think technology seems to magnify the effect of these things. Today, when there's conflict in one part of the world, we get graphic accounts of it almost at the time it's happening, wherever we happen to be in the world. And most of the news that we read is bad news. Unfortunately, news media is biased towards unpleasant things, including India losing a cricket match. And therefore, it feels as if the effects of change and division are very, very strong. But I think it's worth keeping in mind that what we're looking at is not a new phenomenon. I'd also like to differentiate between three words: difference, division, and polarization. This point has already come up that difference is not the same as division. Division is not inevitable just because there's difference. And difference is not necessarily a bad thing. If you look at difference as diversity, for example, right? We all know that for any ecological system to thrive, you need diversity. For humanity to thrive, you need difference. The issue is division. And why does difference become division? And I've added the other word, polarization, right? Which is a kind of extreme division. And one of the things which makes division in today's world so problematic is that usually it's at the level of polarization. You see that not just in differences between countries, you see it in differences in politics, you see it on TV debates. So polarization, and with it the loss of spaces for listening, for coming together, for finding common ground. So division is problematic, right? It creates conflict, creates war, and of course there's also inner division of various kinds, and we'll go into that as well. But what about change? Is change necessarily a bad thing? First of all, as I've pointed out, change is natural. Many changes are beneficial. Some of the changes which happen in the way society thinks on various matters, maybe gender issues or others, are progressive. Because people are understanding, people's attitudes are changing. That can be a good thing. So, change, we need to look at change in a neutral kind of way, not as something that is invariably negative. But the issue of, well, do we change? That's another question, and I think that's a complex question. I won't enter into it now, maybe we can look at it a little later. But there's one profound change that I'd like to draw our attention to, which is now humanity is changing the world, changing the earth in ways that are perhaps irreversible. Humanity has always left its mark on the earth, ever since the beginning of civilization, through settlements, through artifacts of various kinds, but over time these disappear and are replaced by others. But the kind of changes we are making to the earth today seem to be of a different order. In fact, they call the current era, they refer to it, it's sometimes referred to as the Anthropocene, and I would say a bit more about that. The fact is, as never before, the earth is being changed irreversibly by human beings. And to me, that's an indication of a very deep divide. There's a divide between human beings and the rest of nature. So the Anthropocene, here I have 3 quotes from an article that I came across. And so what is the Anthropocene? The current geological age viewed as a period during which human activity has been a dominant influence on climate and the environment. Scientists now agree that human activity, rather than any natural progress, is the primary cause of the accelerated global warming. Agriculture, urbanization, deforestation and pollution have caused extraordinary changes on Earth. Now first, I think it's important to recognize that this is not a 21st century phenomenon. When did it begin? Some say it began with the discovery or invention of agriculture, because agriculture allowed for settlement, which allowed for advances in thinking, eventually to the Industrial Revolution and so on and so forth. Whenever it did begin, the changes that we now see seem to be the culmination of a long process in which human beings acquired the intelligence not only to understand the environment around them, or at least to understand it to a significant degree, but to use it, to master it, to exploit it, and so on. There's a book by Amitabh Ghosh called The Nutmeg's Curse. And in that book, among other things, he's speaking about how colonization, and his main example is in the Dutch East Indies, where the Dutch, when nutmeg turned out to be a very valuable product in the West, they changed the entire ecosystem of several islands in order to plant and grow only nutmeg. So he explores how that kind of activity can change an ecosystem, can change a location, can have profound effects on the climate and on the land for generations to come. And this is something which was happening 300 years ago. And today, of course, we have the technology to do it much more thoroughly and much more quickly. You could say that this intelligence is a mark of what Bronowski called the ascent of man. The intelligence with which man has learnt to live in the world and use it. And the question for me is, what do we feel about this? And we might feel many things. There's a sense of wonder. I mean, it's remarkable the way human ingenuity has created tools, many of which are good for us. It could be a sense of pride. No other species has been able to do this. There may also be a sense of horror. What have we done? And what are we doing in spite of knowing its consequences? So the third quote is just a very specific one. Plastic could become a key marker of the Anthropocene. There's already some evidence that plastic is being deposited into the fossil record. Now, this is a particularly vivid marker of the impact of humanity on the environment. I'm sure we've all heard about the vast dumps of plastic that have found their way into the oceans. There's also this well-known statement that every toothbrush that has ever been manufactured in the world still exists somewhere. And to think that after our time, 20, 30, 50,000 years from now, if there is still intelligent life on the earth, and they were to, from the fossil record, try and understand what our age is, they might refer to it as the plastic age, if plastic has found its way into the fossil record. So anyway, the question I would like to ask here is, does self-knowledge have a bearing on this? What's the connection between the things we see happening around us, things that we are doing, and self-knowledge? And I think it really depends on what we mean by self-knowledge. And so that's what I'd like to go into now. And I'd like to begin with the idea of not knowing. And I'd like to quote here the last stanza of a poem by a wonderful Polish poet called Wisława Szymborska. This poem is called Some People Like Poetry. And in the last stanza, she asks the question, what is poetry? And she wrote this poem not when she was a novice just starting out who was trying to figure out what poetry is all about. This is a late poem. And she was a great poet, a winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature. Poetry, but what is poetry anyway? More than one rickety answer has stumbled since that question first was raised. But I just keep on not knowing, and I cling to that like a redemptive handrail. It may seem at first that this is merely somebody saying helplessly, sorry, I can't do this, I don't know what poetry is. But I think Szymborska is doing more than that. I think what she's indicating is that not knowing is in fact a way of knowing. To know something is to pin it down through definitions, through descriptions, through labels, through concepts. And maybe none of them can quite capture what poetry is. There's another thing. She says, I cling to that like a redemptive handrail. I find that very moving because it suggests that this not knowing is a fragile thing that can be lost. And if you look at it in the way we live, you know, when we meet a person for the first time, one doesn't know that person at all. And that interaction is completely new, fresh, there's no knowing behind it, or very little. From the second time onwards, something has changed. Because already we know something. So, I think that this whole business of not knowing is something that maybe provides us a way of entering into the question of self-knowledge. But then, what is it that Krishnaji says, then what do we mean by self-knowledge? What does knowing oneself mean? Do I know myself? Is the self a static thing, or is it a thing that is always changing? Can I know myself? Do I know my wife, my husband, my child, or do I know only the picture which my mind has created? After all, I cannot know a living thing. I cannot reduce a living thing to a formula. All that I can do is to follow it wherever it may lead. So this is such an interesting thing that Krishnaji is saying. He's saying the self is not static, and therefore you cannot describe it. Therefore, in the usual sense of knowing, you cannot know it. So the question remains then, what do we mean by self-knowledge? Is there any way of knowing something which is not static? So here again I'm referring to a poem. Please pardon me for referring to poetry. Yesterday, Swami Chidananji said that, as a Swami, he was entitled to quote a little bit of Sanskrit. I'm not a Swami, but I have an interest in poetry, and it helps me to understand certain things. So here I'm again quoting Szymborska, and this is the first stanza of a poem. I'd have to be really quick to describe clouds. A split second's enough for them to start meaning something else. I wish I could share the entire poem with you, but we don't have time or space for it. But even in this stanza, she's saying something very interesting. She's saying a split second's enough for them to start meaning something else. Now, of course, in a split second, there's nothing you can describe. In other words, she's saying you can't describe them. And we perhaps face that kind of paradox when we are talking about knowing oneself. I think it's useful also to keep in mind the distinction that Chidananji made yesterday between self-knowledge and self-knowing. And if you remember, he said that knowing implies a certain dynamic kind of quality, it implies movement of some kind. But then, we are saying, if knowing the self is to describe it, and the self is constantly changing, it seems a hopeless task. How do we proceed in this way? Now, the difficulty is, right, in our everyday lives, we are often asked to describe the self, or at least to describe ourselves. Put yourself in the position, for example, of a student who's applying to a college in the US, and you have to write a 500 or 1,000 word essay on yourself. What would you write? Where would you begin? What would you include? What would you leave out? So there are ways in which we try and describe ourselves, but is that the same as self-knowledge? So here are some things that this hypothetical student might do. You might talk of your biographical details. I was born somewhere, I've done this and this in my life, and so on and so forth. The dates, the important markers of one's existence. If I am somewhat analytical, I might also speak about what I understand of my character. Right? I might say that I'm a person who is prejudiced against bananas. I dislike certain things or certain kinds of people or whatever. Right? And then if I've read Krishnamurti, I might say I need to go into my conditioning. Right? Because I'm not only my biographical details, I'm not only my character, I am my conditioning. So I might, in my essay, talk about my conditioning. I was born in such and such circumstances, they influenced me to think in these ways. I saw something happen somewhere that made me think of something, and so on and so forth. You see, there's no end to it. And is all of this the self? again to refer to Chidananji yesterday, he said you can put all of this together and it's a drop in the ocean. Right? So we do this all the time. We describe ourselves, we describe people, we describe things, right? And maybe miss out on reality. Now, earlier I asked this question about this obsession with looking at oneself. And I think it may be useful at this point to make a distinction between myself and what you might call the self. So what is it one is interested in? Is one obsessively interested in just oneself or in understanding what the self is all about? And what that self is might not in fact be very different from person to person. Maybe looking at oneself is a window into looking at the self and the way it operates. But I think this is a distinction that needs to be made. In that passage that I quoted, Krishnamurti talks about following the self. And this seems to be promising. Because following suggests that it allows you a way to look at something that's dynamic. Maybe you can't describe the clouds, but you can keep looking at them, you can follow them, or you can follow the river, sitting by it. And it's endlessly fascinating because it seems to be the same river, but in fact it's never the same water, it's always changing. And that's a nice metaphor in some way for the self. So can one also follow oneself the same way? And again, referring to yesterday's talk, Chidananji pointed out how there are so many levels to this looking. So you're looking at something within you, then you're aware that you're looking, then you're aware that your mind is distracted, you're aware that you're distracted, you're sort of happy about this whole process of looking, and so on and so forth. Right? But while this is promising, this whole idea of following the self as opposed to knowledge of the self, there is this issue. It also suggests that there's a follower and a follower. There's somebody who's following and that there's something to be followed. Now in the case of the river, that may be very clear. Right? Except maybe in some very profound mystical sense, I'm not the river. But I am presumably myself. So what does it mean to follow myself? And who is following me? And this brings us to this thing that came up again in Chidananji's talk yesterday. The observer and the observed. Now, excuse this somewhat mathematical title for the next slide. But the question is, the root of all division in human beings is the division as the observer and the observed. Now, what does this mean? See, we are aware, if we are at all interested, that there are several divisions in the human experience. There's the obvious division between me and you, or between me and everything else, and everyone else. I'm aware of divisions within myself. The so-called division, for example, between heart and head. My reason is telling me that a certain course of action is right. My heart, so-called, is pulling me in another direction. I'm also aware, if I'm interested and I go into it, that there's a division within me between what is and what I think should be. So I'm aware that I'm envious. Something is telling me I should not be envious. I should be free of envy. And that's a division too, between what is and my notion of what should be. And there is this division, which is, I think, a very subtle and difficult one. That between the observer and the observed. How do we make sense of it? At one level, rationally, it looks as if one can make this distinction. But in actual life, that sense of separation, that sense of me is always there, or always seems to be there. Right? And it seems to me that this division is really the fundamental division. And it underlies not just conflict within ourselves, but because in a similar way we separate ourselves from everything else, it underlies all conflict. This is how I understand Krishnamurti's saying that this division is the root of all division. So now the question is, can anything be done about this? There is a division between you and the thing you observe, that is a fact. Now find out why this division exists. Why can't you look at yourself as you look at that tree without any resistance, without any condemnation, just observe. If you observe that way, there's no separation and therefore no conflict. Now, this particular thing, why can't you look at yourself as you look at that tree? Now, I remember when I was a student at Rishi Valley and Krishnaji used to give talks to students, I remember in one of his talks he asked exactly this question, or at least the first part of it. Can you look at a tree without naming it? Right? And in Rishi Valley there was a beautiful open auditorium, so you could actually look out at the trees. I may have been, I don't know, in class 8 or class 9 or something. And I remember trying very sincerely and very hard to look at a tree without naming it. And of course, I failed, and I was aware of my failure. And I asked myself, why is it that I couldn't do this thing? Why could I not look at a tree without labels? I'm not sure I have an answer. Maybe it was too self-conscious an attempt of something which I just hadn't understood. I have to admit that I sometimes still try to do this. And whenever I try to do it, I fail. So, in some ways, I think we don't change very much. So, we can understand this distinction, right? This division between the observer and the observed. We also see that it underlies all our relationships. The self is strongly there in every relationship, which raises a disturbing question, and I've asked it in a deliberately provocative way. Is relationship then futile? What does relationship mean if the self is at the heart of it? Which means even your relationship with the person you think of as being closest to you is in fact like two selves which may have the intelligence to adjust to each other, but those two selves are still strongly there. So what meaning does relationship have? And of course the paradox here is that there's no life without relationship. Right? I think Krishnji puts it succinctly, says something like, to live is to be related. So relationship is there. Right? Now there are two ways of looking at this. One is to say that relationship is there, but it is flawed. It's flawed because the self is also there. But here I think there is a kind of light at the end of the tunnel. Because one thing that Krishnji points out is that relationship is also a way, a means to understanding the self. So here he says, whereas true relationship, which is not a distraction, is really a state in which you are constantly in a process of understanding yourself in relation to something. That is, relationship is a process of self-revelation, not of distraction. And that self-revelation is very painful because in relationship you soon find yourself out and so on. Okay. The central point here, it seems to me, is that self-knowledge actually needs relationship. It's not something that you can go into a cave and acquire. It's through relationship that things get revealed. But the question here is, how does this actually happen? In what? This is one of those things which I used to take for granted because it seemed so self-evident. The mirror of relationship, such a powerful, beautiful metaphor. And I never really thought about it. So again, gratitude to people who invited me to do this talk because I found I needed to think about this. I took envy as an example. So I see when I'm alone and things seem to be going smoothly, that I seem to be completely free of envy. It doesn't take much for that envy to show itself in my connection with somebody. That person does something which others value, and I wish I had that. That's envy. It's a common enough feeling. Now, one is to have the knowledge of the fact that I'm envious. Right? And that's interesting and it's useful, but I don't think it does very much. And I don't think that knowledge changes anything. But there's something else that happens, which is something stirs up that envy. And there's that moment when you experience it. And then, of course, later you rationalize it and you do many things. But what is interesting is that moment of envy or anger or whatever it is. And I think that moment is key. If at that moment one is attentive to it, not just seeing something you know is going to happen because you know you're envious, but actually looking at that envy, it seems to me that something changes in the envy and in oneself. This is something which I truly believe, and I'm not saying this is an idea, I've actually seen this happen. I'm not saying that, therefore, next time I will not be envious. I will. Maybe that's something I'm born with and can do nothing about. But at that moment of seeing, right, that envy seems to lose its force. In other words, my third statement I made, attentiveness actually alters relationship. In that moment of attention, right, something can change, but not by wanting it to change. But then a question arises, if one is attentive in this way, I'm attentive to my envy or whatever it is, does the world change? What is the impact on the world? We're looking at change and division, self-knowledge as a way of understanding these things. There's a fascinating passage which brings together various things. Is not the world with all its lies, its corruption, hatred and starvation brought about by human beings? So to bring about a tremendous change in the world, you and I must change, must we not? We must know ourselves. Unfortunately, most of us think that tyranny, politics or various forms of legislation will solve our problems. But what the individual is, the world is. And to bring about a fundamental change, you, the individual, must understand yourself. And the understanding of yourself must be complete, not just partial. Self-knowledge is the beginning of wisdom, and to know yourself is not a miracle or something extraordinary to be learned from books. You can see yourself exactly as you are in the mirror of relationship. Nothing can live in isolation. You're related to people, to things, to ideas, to nature. And in the mirror of that relationship, you can see the totality of your own being. It's a wonderful passage to me because it brings together a number of things. My theme for this talk is partly about connections, and I think Krishnaji was constantly establishing connections between things that we don't always see are related. And I'd like to draw your attention to the passages which I've put in italics. To bring about a tremendous change in the world, you and I must change. So here's one connection. The change in the world can only happen through change in the individual. Of course, there's a kind of counter question. Will change in the individual produce change in the world? I don't know. But change in the world cannot happen without change in the individual. Then the second one which I've highlighted, to bring about a fundamental change, the individual must understand himself. So if we're talking about change, change cannot happen without understanding. It's not something that you can will, it's not something that you can create a kind of blueprint for and say, I will move there. It can only begin through self-understanding. And the third connection, you can see yourself exactly as you are in a mirror relationship. So that self-understanding happens only in relationship, in the mirror. So this connection between change in the outer world, change in oneself, self-understanding, and relationship, I think is worth keeping in mind. And I'd also, we were talking about self-knowledge, but Krishnamurti, we are now using other words. There's understanding. And even more than that, there's the word seeing. Can you see yourself? Right? And let's remember that the metaphor of a mirror implies seeing. In a mirror you see. You don't look at a mirror in order to understand. You look at a mirror in order to see. So the metaphor, I think, the power of that metaphor is that in relationship, in the mirror relationship, there's the opportunity to see something, as opposed to logically arrive at a conclusion, which is what we normally do. So, here at the end of this, nothing can live in isolation, you're related, and so on and so forth. So everything is connected, but we have this illusion that we are not connected. And this brings me to the second part of my title, which was Only Connect, and that's a quotation I've taken from a novel by Ian Foster called Howard's End. Only connect the prose and the passion, and both will be exalted, and human love will be seen at its height. Live in fragments no longer, only connect, and the beast and the monk, robbed of the isolation that is life to either, will die. This needs a little explanation, and I'm going to interpret this a little bit. It's dangerous to interpret Krishnamurti, and one shouldn't be doing it, but I'm a student of literature, so I feel entitled to try and interpret a passage of literature. So the question is, what do the prose and the passion signify? Bring them together, he says, both will be exalted. To me, the prose suggests something like what we normally talk of as understanding, the rational mind and what it can do, making sense, describing, connecting things logically, and so on. The passion is something else. There's more to do with what I was earlier referring to as intention, feeling, being touched by something, and I'll come back to this idea of being touched. And when they come together, normally we separate them. When we separate them, there's a very profound division we seem to make within our own intelligence, between rationality and the so-called non-rational. But when they come together, something exalted happens, he suggests. And what about the beast and the monk? In my understanding, the beast is all of us in our everyday lives when we are living non-reflective lives. When we are creatures of appetite, our reactions, there's no thought, there's no space for reflection. We're just living. To me, that's what I call the beast. And the monk is the person who sees this and wants to run away from it in order to acquire wisdom. The monk isolates himself because he sees that the beastly way of living is not what he wants to live. The problem is that both of these are isolated. The person, the beast, the so-called beast and the so-called monk are both in different ways disconnected from the world. When they come together and when one is in relationship, something else happens. There's connection, there's relationship, there's understanding and all of that. But what about when there's polarization? If we're talking about the importance of connections, is there a connection possible, for example, between people in Israel and people in Gaza? And I'd like to mention here an interesting example of connection. There's a great Argentinian pianist and conductor called Daniel Barenboim, and a great Palestinian-American intellectual who passed away many years ago called Edward Said. Both of them had a deep shared interest in music. And they set up something called the West Eastern Divan Orchestra, which brought together young musicians from all of these countries: Israel, Jordan, Palestine, Egypt, Iran, brought them together in an orchestra to play music together. The idea was that music was a common ground for them. And in that common ground, if they could come together on a common ground, perhaps there would be some possibility of their finding other spaces for common ground. In yesterday's video, Krishnji was speaking about something like this. Human beings are fundamentally the same. Whether we like it or not, we do share a common ground. So the illusion, so this fact that there's difference, there's division, all these rest on profound illusions, that we have different interests. Right? And the challenge is to be able to see through that. And attention may help us to find a common ground. I'm almost done. Sorry, I'd like to tell you a story. The story is of a bird in a forest living on a particular tree. And one day a fire breaks out in the forest. And the fire is a raging fire. Soon that tree is going to be burnt down. All the animals start fleeing from the forest. The trees, of course, have to be where they are. This little bird goes to a pond nearby, dips its body in the pond, flies back to the tree and shakes its wings so that some drops of water fall on the tree. And it keeps doing this again and again and again. Even the tree tells the bird, listen, go away. The bird is getting singed, other animals are laughing at this bird, but the bird keeps doing this. Finally, the gods come that way and they ask the bird what it is doing, and it tells them. They're so moved that they weep. And the clouds are full of rain and the fire goes out. So this is the story. And there's a song that comes out of this story. At the end of today's session, I'd like to share that song with you. But here are two stanzas from the song. My friend, the fire lit the forest, a bird came and sat, the wingless tree cried out, I'm ablaze, I have to burn, but you, winged one, should fly. The bird says, my friend, I ate your fruit, soiled your leaves, played from branch to branch, leave you to burn and fly away? We live and love but once. It's interesting that both in this passage and in the previous one from Foster, the word love is used. Krishnji also uses it, as we will see. But anyway, from this story, in times of fire, in the story, what is it that we're being shown in this little story? Obviously a deep connectedness. Both bird and tree are concerned for the well-being of the other. The feeling of being part of something larger whose well-being matters. a refusal to accept defeat in the face of overwhelming odds, a bird going up and down with its few drops of water, doing what is necessary regardless of its impact. Doesn't matter that the fire is not going out, but the bird is still doing what it has to do. Underlying all this an awareness of the self. Where is the self in all of this? Now this may seem like a kind of ideal sort of scenario, but I'd like to say it isn't. Right? Humanity is not all beastly. During times of crisis, most recently during the pandemic, there were several stories one heard of people acting in utterly selfless ways to help others, often strangers. And this is something that has been documented. There are historians who worked on this, including a man called Rutger Bregman in a book called Humankind, A Hopeful History. It's easy to feel cynical about humanity by looking only at the negatives and the divisions. But in fact, we do experience the common ground as well, which means that it's there as a possibility. And this is my final quote. But before I come to the quote, that's that wonderful story which happens in a time of fire. The problem is, I think that most of the time we don't recognize that there is a fire. Therefore, we don't feel called upon to act. We are not touched by that fire. And so we come to the touch of life. Because we do not love the earth and the things of the earth, but merely utilize them, we are insensitive to the beauty of a waterfall and have lost the touch of life. We don't sit with our backs against the trunk of a tree, and since we do not love nature, we do not know how to love human beings. We have lost the sense of tenderness, that sensitivity that responds to things of beauty. It is only in the renewal of that sensitivity that we can have understanding of what is true relationship. That sensitivity does not come in the mere hanging of a few pictures or in painting a tree or putting flowers in your hair. Sensitivity comes only when this utilitarian attitude is put aside. It does not mean you cannot use the earth, but you must use the earth as it is to be used. Again, in this passage, Krishnamurti seems to bring together, seems to connect things in such interesting ways. The touch of life and humanity, the inability to connect with nature and the inability therefore to connect with human beings, and so on. So, finally, what does this mean to experience the touch of life? To me, it's such a resonant and beautiful phrase that I'd really rather not say anything about it. I feel as if anything I say will reduce it. But I think it's worth just holding in mind as something to think about. What is this touch of life that we don't seem to experience that often? Can sensitivity be cultivated? I think it can. I think that's why these schools exist. And it seems to me that without it, what are we doing? It seems to me that whatever it means to cultivate sensitivity, that is our only hope. Because without that, there is this entire chain of loss of connection. And in the end of that passage, Krishnamurti says, it's not that you can't use the word, but use it as it is to be used. This is again a question I think that's worth pondering on, a statement. What is it to use the earth as it is to be used? Among other things, of course, it implies using the word with respect and restraint. But what does that mean? And can one do that in the absence of self-knowledge, which now I hope I've made clear is not knowledge but a quality of attentiveness? To have this touch of life is to have the touch of our humanity. I'm just repeating what Krishnamurti says. And finally, to come back to, division and change. Without that touch, without that quality of attentiveness in the moment, there's no way we can deal with division. Division is always going to be there, whether inner or outer. There are no shortcuts to it. There's no UN peacekeeping force that can remove division between people or inner divisions. And we also, without that attentiveness, I think, to the way we connect with the world, I think we won't know how to relate correctly with change either. Whether it's again inner change or the changes we see in the world. So, I'm sorry, I took a little longer than I'd expected, and I'll stop here. And if there are any questions or thoughts, please feel free. At the end of our session, I would like to share the song, the bird song I told you about, because I think it's nice to listen to.
Good morning, sir. Thank you for a wonderful, insightful talk. If you could show slide 13, where there was a mention of beast and monk. So my question is, don't we have the beast and monk within ourselves?
Yes, I think we do. I think we do have both within us.
So that brings us to, again, that division of observer and observe. So how to address this?
See, if whatever we mean by these specific metaphors, the beast and the monk, and obviously they're both metaphors, I think the point that's being made in this passage is that both in their own ways are isolated. The beast, because the beast has no interest in anything apart from his or her own pleasures. The monk, because the monk sees a solution to this as going off into an isolated space. You run away from relationship. And I think what Foster is suggesting, that in fact connection is very important, and that both the beast and the monk who are disconnected need to find ways of connecting in their own ways. And in that connection, something changes. And why it is that something changes is because it's in connection that you start seeing yourself. Krishnji's metaphor of the mirror. And therefore relationship is essential. If we are saying that the best hope for us as a species is to understand ourselves better, or to see ourselves better, can we do it without connecting? Can we do it without relationship? And I'm suggesting, or rather I should say Krishnji and Foster are suggesting, that you can't.
Should we think about integration? So Kulshravathi said that integrate mind and heart. Right? And there is a line here, he says, Foster is saying live in fragments no longer. So perhaps that's the answer.
Yeah, I think that's one way of looking at it, integration. I mean, that's again, it's both again another mathematical metaphor. How do you bring together? I think it's, in fact, actually to me, it's not really about integration, because I'm not sure how these integration suggests you're melding two things together. And I'm not sure how these two things, which seem so far apart, can come together. I think it's something else that's being talked about. It's not, let's put A and B together, but let's set A and B aside and see what else is there.
Thank you for a lovely talk. It's not a question really, but when you spoke about change...
Sorry, I can't see where you...
Yeah.
Yes. Oh,
yeah, so thank you for an insightful talk. And when you spoke about change as being so constant, I just felt like saying, I wish it was. Because it seems like more often than not, I'm stuck with a certain static description of self or narrative of self that seems unchanging. And so to kind of, even to keep a certain fluidity about the fact seems difficult.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think you're right. I think the issue, and you put it very nicely, is that you're stuck with a static narrative. The issue is not the self, but the issue is the narrative. I think that we fall into descriptions of ourselves, and those are static. And of course, some things don't change, like my attempts, my wholehearted, sincere attempts to look at a tree without labeling it. Right? If I ask myself, have I changed? Recently I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, and she was telling me, I can see how much I've changed in the last 2 or 3 months. And I was a little bit envious because I don't have that kind of clarity about myself. Right? And why is that? I think it's because one associates change with things one can say about change. And then the things one says are invariably not the whole truth. You change and you don't change. It's a mix of things that's happening there. But the moment you feel compelled to say something about it, say something which others can understand or you can understand yourself, I think the life goes out of that scene. So for me the challenge is, can one just watch what's happening? It's very, very difficult. Because invariably one moves into words and so on and so forth.
Good morning, sir. Good morning, sir. So, I don't have a question really. There were many during the talk, but now I am taking this opportunity to say thank you. Your talk was stunning in a way that with regard to K teachings, it hit many nails on the head. Also, a heartfelt thank you to you, and thank God for keeping the poet in you alive. I think that made all the difference to this talk. Thank you very much, sir.
Well, thank you for saying that. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for the beautiful talk.
Sorry, where are you?
So I'm here. So as you highlighted in the talk about connection, and I know Krishnamurti also says that emphasizes the importance of relationship. He uses the term metaphor, the mirror of relationship. But he has also talked about the importance of being alone. So how do you see that in this context?
Yeah. Thank you, that's a nice question. In fact, yesterday Dr. Shirali was drawing our attention to that passage about the gatherings, and then he speaks about seriousness, but also about time to be alone and time for silence. I think to find time alone is not a way of separating yourself from the world. It can be, like the monk in Foster's metaphor, seems to want to cut himself off. So I don't think Krishnaji is speaking about being alone in that way. I think what he's referring to is, even in a busy and crowded life that is full of relationships and full of everyday responsibilities, to be able to do two things. One is physically sometimes to find some space for oneself, because life throws all kinds of challenges and sometimes you just need a little space, which will actually help you to connect better. It's not a separation, it's an aloneness which brings you back to yourself and strengthens your relationship with others. So that's one thing. And I think the second and maybe more subtle aspect of aloneness is even in company and even in the course of one's everyday interactions and so on, to retain a quality of aloneness in which your mind is not merely swept away by whatever is happening. Now this is very subtle because it could sound like, again, a kind of separation. You're standing in judgment, you're standing separate, but I don't think it's that. It's more being in touch with yourself, even in connection with the other. It's like when I was trying to understand what seeing yourself in a mirror relationship is, that moment of seeing. Right now you say something to me, it angers me, it hurts me, right? But while it is doing those things, can I also see it? Now that seeing comes from a space of aloneness. So that's how I understand it. I don't understand it as a separation. Therefore, I don't see a contradiction.
Hello. Hello, Siddharth. So, thank you for the talk. In one of the slides, Krishnaji is talking about intention, the intention to change. And that
Go on.
and that came as something different in Krishnaji when he's talking about that we need to intend to change. And
Just a small correction. The intention to understand.
yes,
That's the phrase. Go on.
the intention to understand. And we often see that this intention to understand, usually in our daily course of life, arises often only in moments of crisis, when one is facing a conflict, and when it is actually cornering oneself, when it is giving a lot of pain. That is when you feel helpless, that you feel like understanding. And inevitably, in this situation, the intention to understand arises from a desire to actually get over the conflict, from a desire to resolve the conflict. So when you share this paragraph, this sort of seemed like a paradox to me, that while I fully relate with this, with the intention to understand, but Krishnaji is pointing out that till the time there is a motive, there is an objective to your understanding. Your understanding is not complete. So I would just like to request you to share your thoughts around this.
My first thought is that you put this so clearly, and I completely resonate with the paradox you're pointing out, which is more often than not, we become interested in understanding something because it troubles us, right? Because we're experiencing it. So we're looking at fear because the experience of fear is real. And the paradox, of course, is that at that moment, when you're caught in fear, the intention to understand is complicated by the desire to be free of fear. And so there is a secondary intention, if you like, or maybe that's even the primary intention. The intention really is, how can I get over my fear? It may not even be about understanding fear. Right? How do I quickly free myself from it? So you're right, that's true. and I don't have an answer to it. All I can say is if one is aware that this is what is happening, at least then you're not caught in believing your intention is something when actually it's something else. Maybe one can watch that process and something may emerge. I don't know if I can say more than that. You've pointed out a very real situation. But I think there's also maybe another way of looking at it too. And I'm just thinking aloud. You were making a distinction between myself and the self. And of course, we go into these questions with a lot more energy when we seem to be looking at our own personal issues. Right? But then, history shows us that it's possible to be interested in these issues, and not just interested, but passionately engaged with these issues, even if they are no longer yours, or never were yours. Yeah. I mean, let me just let's take Krishnaji's example. Krishnaji went through his own experience of intense suffering when his brother died, and there was conflict within the Theosophical Society and so on, and then he broke away from it. And we need to ask ourselves why he spent 60 years after that talking to people. In one of my first slides, I asked, is it that change and division today are at a scale where they cause us to despair? Seems to me that in Krishnaji's life work, there was no place for despair. I think he felt that profound change was possible if you gave your life to it. And I think, when you listen to him speaking and he's unraveling a psychological issue. And I remember long ago, soon after I joined Shirali, actually asking Dr. Shirali about this. You have this sense that he really knows intimately from the inside what it is to feel fear or division or whatever it is. So when he's speaking about it, it's as if he's unfolding your experience of it. Even though it may not be his experience of it, he's yet doing it with great authenticity. And I think that's because, his insight was not about himself, but his insight was about the self. And that self is something we all share. And so we feel that when he's speaking, when we listen to him speaking, we feel he's speaking about us. So the challenge, I think, and that's the response to your question is, what is it that may change our interest in myself to the self? As I told you, this is originally in the Buddhist tradition, but eventually, if you can come back to the slideshow. Yeah, thank you. Eventually, the song finds its way into the Kabir tradition. And so here it's being sung in the Rajasthani folk tradition. And this is the song. And the song itself is attributed to Dharamdas, who was a disciple of Kabir, who is believed to have been a disciple of Kabir. And as I was saying earlier, I think we learn in different ways. We are touched by different things, including possibly song. And so let's just listen to this as a way of finishing this session. And I just wanted to share it with you because I find the song deeply moving. So I'm being a bit self-indulgent, so please bear with me. Thank you.
Yeah.